We're back. Thank you for joining this week's of Sort of Insights. During this week's show, we're going to cover two primary topics. The first one's going to be an update on the so-called peace process, and the second one is going to be some special comments about what is likely to be one of the biggest issues of this year, which is the likely upcoming filings with the ICC, which is the International Criminal Court. Let's start off with our first topic, which is the so-called peace process. And we're going to go through what the recent developments and comments are by each of the different sides. We'll first start with Mr. Ilham Aliyev in Baku. And after not talking about this for a while, he's back to talking about his essentially demanding the Sunni corridor and saying that this was part of the infamous November 9th agreement that ended the war in 2020. And going further, which is very interesting, demanding Russian control of that road. Now let's move on to the comments made by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. He actually corrected Mr. Aliyev, telling him that the November 9th agreement makes absolutely no comment and actually says nothing about the supposed Zangezur corridor. At the same time, he attacked Armenia and complained that Armenia opposes the Russian control of such a road if it is ever built. Quoting him directly, he blamed Armenia for cooling Armenian-Russian relations by saying Azerbaijan is ready to sign a peace treaty with Armenia on Russian territory, but Yerevan's position remains unclear. Now, the most important and critical thing here is the absurdity of this reference by both sides to the November 9th agreement, which supposedly was supposed to end the war in 2020. In reality, it didn't do so, because both of these parties, both the regime in Baku and the government in Moscow, has violated every single part of that agreement, and now they're demanding for that agreement to be used against us in this case. Now, what's noteworthy here is actually the Russian position, because at this point, the great Russian power and their influence here has been reduced to this road. If there's no road, there's frankly no justification for them to be here. So it tells you to the extent that the Russian role is being limited and marginalized in this region, in Armenia in particular. Now we'll move on to the Prime Minister's statements. He gave a very negative response to the rhetoric coming out of Baku, saying that this unconstructive attitude is making peace impossible. And he also denounced the entire corridor idea, saying that there's a similar by-road to Nakhchivan from Azerbaijan proper that goes through Iran, and they follow all the rules through Iran, so they can use our roads when all the roads open under the same manner without having any exclusive right or a corridor. Now let's move on to what the response has been from the European Union, the US, and NATO. They've all been very strong in their language about the need to protect and the importance of Armenia's territorial integrity, how they cannot be violated. But, we've seen these statements before. Let's see what they're worth. One of the ones that came to mind was a comment that was made by EU High Representative, which is the equivalent of their foreign minister, on September 21st, which was the day of the attack that began the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. And this is a statement: forced displacement of the civilian population through military or other means will be met with a strong response by the EU. Then we move on to a statement at a U.S. Senate hearing that was made by Yuri Kim, which was the State Department representative in our area. Let's watch that now.
The United States will not countenance any effort or action, short-term or long-term, to ethnically cleanse or commit other atrocities against the Armenian people of northern Nagorno-Karabakh. The current humanitarian situation is not acceptable. Humanitarian access through the Lachin corridor and other routes must be available. Now we will do everything possible to make that happen.
After all of these strong words from the European Union and promises of action by the United States, Ilham Aliyev carried out what is the largest violation of human rights and war crime on the European continent in this century, outside of the Ukraine war, without a single reprimand to him or anyone in his regime. In truth, all of these statements mean almost nothing. Now, what are we to see moving forward from this point? I think it's very clear that Ilham is not going to meet any of the U.S. demands and deadlines for signing a peace treaty with Armenia. We're likely to see a continual worsening of relations between the regime in Baku and the West in general, and actually a far more clear move in the Russian direction, essentially the Central Asianization of the country and moving it away from the West, and there's a lot of indications of that. In truth, Aliyev got what he wanted from the West, which was a write-off, a looking away, and a tacit approval of ethnic cleansing in Artsakh without any consequences. So now he can move on to the more totalitarian direction without having to worry about any of the consequences. And as long as any of the measures taken against him do not reflect or do not affect financial matters, i.e. selling gas or other things, or more importantly, the assets that he is hiding in the West, I don't think this is something that's going to move him. Moving and looking forward into next year, I think it's very clear that from this point on, Ilham is going to try to stall the U.S. administration, because I think he expects a return of Donald Trump, which he sees as someone far more favorable to his interests for many different reasons. They have a personal relationship, business relationships that go back with the family, and he was by far the most pro-Azeri administration in U.S. history when he was in power. What we are likely entering is a period of a long, cold peace with an X factor that things can change on the dime. What is important is for us to use whatever time there is to actually strengthen ourselves, because frankly, there are no saviors out there. And if we want help, we better start looking into the mirror. On a side note, before we move on to this topic, I have a sort of a personal pet peeve here is, I cannot tell you how many times I heard this from Westerners, specifically Europeans, about how it's important for us and how Armenia can move on and prosper if you just walk away from Artsakh, give it up, it's not your territory, it's 100,000 people, why don't you move them and be done with it? And then you can have peace and you can have development, you can have all these wonderful things happen. And what we have learned is that none of those things happen. So my question to you is, what do you say now? Because the outcome that you wanted actually did happen. There are no Armenians left in Artsakh. And we still are dealing with aggressions on a daily basis. And I think fundamentally what you don't want to admit to yourselves, and you haven't wanted to admit it, and I'm hoping you see the light now, is that Ilham Aliyev's issues with this country are existential in nature. Secondly, that his regime dies without an Armenian enemy, which he cannot do without. And criminality is the very basic essence of his state and nothing else. Now let's move on to the second topic of the week, which is what's going to come up this year. And it's the big important decisions that are to be made by our government, different parties, and the courts that we're dealing with on an international level. These are the ICC filings. And what would this be about? Essentially, now that Armenia has signed on to the Rome Statute, we can actually bring these charges in front of the International Criminal Court that has the power to act. And they will be specifically, if you want to narrow it down, there's many, it's endless. The human rights violations by the Aliyev regime are endless, but if we're going to narrow it down to specific areas, is going to be the September 22 invasion and the war crimes and executions and rapes and murders of POWs that happened during that invasion. And secondly, obviously, what is the biggest crime of our times, which was the ethnic cleansing and genocide in Artsakh that was carried out in September of last year. Now let's go over how this process works. And this is something, the cases are probably going to be ready sometime over the next 6 months to be filed. And the first thing to know is that you do not have to be a state to actually file these charges. Any aggrieved group parties, aggrieved human beings who have been wronged or have their human rights violated can file these things. But the reality is this is far more likely to be acted upon by the court and the prosecutors if a state is behind it. Actually, it's far better to have multiple states behind it. I think when Ukraine filed in the ICC against Russia, there were 40 different countries that signed on to it. It's very clear that it's very important for our state to prioritize this. And in fact, to build political support among other people to come in support of these filings. Now, why do I say this government is going to be under pressure? I think there's going to be international pressure by different centers of power for us not to go through with these filings for very different reasons. There'll be pressure from Russia. They were the ones actually vigorously pushing us and threatening us not to join this court. Essentially, no, it was not about them, it was about protecting Baku. And I think in this case, they will do the same for us not to join in the filings. This is to protect their local patron, their local puppet in Baku, Ilham Aliyev in this case. And I think from the Americans, what we're going to get is we're going to get pressure that any filings that you do is going to disrupt their sacred peace process, which for the last year has essentially given us the second Armenian genocide and no peace. Now, I think when this pressure comes from any country, our answer should be a very strong no. And let me explain to you why. The one thing that we know is that Ilham Aliyev does not want to be turned into a Saddam or a Pol Pot. He wants the respectability still to an extent that it exists for him, that he can come and go to Davos, that he could be dealt with as some sort of a normalized statesperson. And unlike Putin, who doesn't really care about ICC filing because his country is a nuclear power and one of the most important countries in the world, no matter what you think of it, Ilham Aliyev is a third-rate leader of a third-rate country. So he's a marginal figure. And if there's any filings against him, it's going to essentially end him as any kind of an international political player. It is because of these reasons that we need to be very aggressive on these filings and build support for them, because doing so is actually a national security issue in protecting our national security, above and beyond the fact that it's a matter of justice for us that we need to act on this front and be very vigorous in prosecuting crimes that were committed against our people over the last 3 or 4 years. In conclusion, the demonization, criminalization, and the delegitimization of the regime in Baku must be one of our top priority items for the purposes of achieving national security. Thank you for joining me in this Successor Insights.
Hermann Wilhelm Goering, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. Joachim von Ribbentrop, death by hanging. Fritz Saukel, death by hanging. Julius Streicher, death by hanging. Wilhelm Frick, death by hanging. Hans Frank, death by hanging. Alfred Rosenberg, death by hanging. Wilhelm Keitel, death by hanging. Ernst Kelsen.